I would like to talk about the early days of the Revival of Freemasonry in 1717. There are many interesting facts that give a new meaning to Freemasonry. Hello, this talk will be mainly based on my latest book, Freemasonry, Initiation by Light. Can you see that? Oh, there we are. There we are. Publishers suggested that I divide the book into smaller units. So it was a larger book to start with. So I divided it into one book for each degree. And most of today's talk is based on the first degree, this book, Initiation by Light. In it, I talk about how the craft started and the opposition to it, the early history, and probably why it started. And also, I give a possible source for the idea of the first degree. Where did that idea come from? In the books, I do not talk about the secrets of Freemasonry, and I won't talk about them in this video either. I believe it's very important to understand Freemasonry in the context of what was happening at London at the time. So why people were attracted to Freemasonry and why people wanted to make it in the first place. Let me share some pictures with you. Many people believe that Freemasonry is connected to the Templars. However, I do not, for three reasons. This is a picture of Roslin Chapel, which is near Edinburgh. And there are many Templar tombs and also carvings inside this private chapel. It was built started in 1450 and finished in 1488. That is already about 150 years after the Knights Templar were disbanded. So Freemasonry, what we call speculative Freemasonry, started in 1716, 1717. And the reason that Templars do not have a connection with the beginnings are threefold. Firstly, the Templars were Catholics, and England, since 1453, had been a Protestant country, and to a great extent, Catholics were not welcome. Secondly, the Templars were soldier priests. So they were soldiers, but they were also in the Catholic Church as priests. But in the ritual, there is no reference to chivalry or Christianity. And the last reason I don't think there is a connection is that there is a 400-year gap between their suppression in 1309 and the start of speculative Freemasonry in 1717. That is about 16 generations, which is a very long time to keep secrets when you have no organization. Queen Elizabeth died in 1603. She was a staunch Protestant, but she had no children. So on her death, the Catholic King James of Scotland became King of England. He was eligible to be king as he was the great-great-grandson of King Henry VII. But a Catholic king ruling over Protestant England brought many problems to the country. For example, assassination attempts, such as the Gunpowder Plot, where Guy Fawkes and his friends try to blow up the Houses of Parliament when King James was attending the state opening. However, these Catholic terrorists were caught and executed. Guy Fawkes is the one on the left. Do you recognize him? He's come quite famous. Do you recognize him now? This mask of the anarchist was based on his image. During the latter part of the Stuart era, when King Charles II was king, there was a fire, what we call the Great Fire of London. This is what London, the city of London at the time, looked like. And I will get some. Down here on the right is the Tower of London. And leading from the Tower of London, in a very strange way, was a wall. It was a walled city. This is St. Paul's Cathedral. And so there was a fire in 1660 about here, and it spread across the whole of the city because it was a walled city. It mainly contained the fire. Some of it escaped out of here. When we look at the next picture, this is a map after the fire, and now you can see this is again the Tower of London, St. Paul's, and now you can see the wall that goes around and meets up with the Tower of London. All of this area we now call the city was destroyed. In total, 13,000 buildings were burnt, but they say that only a few people lost their lives, which is remarkable. The weather was very windy at the time, and it fanned the flames from one side from the west to the east. Among St. Paul's Cathedral was also burnt, but what I find is fascinating was there were 87 churches also burnt to the ground at this time. This whole area is about, we call it the square mile. In fact, it's a bit wider than 1 mile and less than 1 mile. But now the City of London, which is the financial centre of London, we call it the square mile. But there must have been considerable religious fervour at the time to justify so many churches, because it calculates to 1 church for every 150 houses, or 1 church for every 3 streets. Quite remarkable. This is the whole of London, and this map was made in 1746. You can see the same images in my book. Again, this is the Tower of London. This is St. Paul's here. By this time, another bridge had been added to this, and there's another one down here. What this shows is that there's a large area of white around the city. These are all orchards and fields and private ground and some park. This area here, and the kind of the elbow of the River Thames, is the city of Westminster. And this is where the aristocracy lived. Buckingham Palace was just about here, St. James's Park, St. James's Palace is here. And at the time, the king was living, this is Hyde Park. And if you go down just off the edge here, for another half a mile, you come to Kensington Palace. That was where the king was living. And the queen had her own palace here. At the time was called Queen's Palace, but is now called Buckingham Palace. So why this is so important, well, just to go back a bit, this is where the aristocracy lived. At the time, this is 1746, but in 1660, this was all arable land, and there was just one road between called the Strand. You can see the road. This area is the mercantile capital of the City of London. And if you look at this map in great detail, you can see that these are all wharves and they're warehouses. And because the London Bridge was here, it stopped large ships going any further up the river. So all the warehouses and all along this area along here, and this is all where, even today, there are still large old warehouses along this area. This became what is known as the West End, and fashionable people started, and rich people started buying up this land and building large houses. And Buckingham Palace originally was owned by the Duke of Buckingham, but he sold it to the king. So to look at this, how it relates to Freemasonry, if we can look here, this is my drawing. It's just about fits in. You can see that this is the last map of where the fire was. This is the Tower of London and St. Paul's, the three bridges, Buckingham Palace, Hyde Park, etc. This is the West End. So here we can see marked square and compasses, 4 places. The one, let's start in reverse. These 2 here were operative lodges, and they were there because they were helping to rebuild not just the city, but also fashionable London. The West End was paid for by rich dukes, building large houses and terraced houses and fashionable areas like Covent Garden. So there was a lot of work for operative masons. This here was the Goose and Gridiron, was right next to St. Paul's, and presumably everybody was involved in rebuilding St. Paul's. Down here, number 8, is where the Houses of Parliament was. And this is where the lodge at the Rummer and Grapes was based. Rummer and Grapes was a tavern right next to the Houses of Parliament, where George Payne also lived. Later, the Masons, they moved to a different tavern or pub, but in the same street, and it was called the Horn, and it became famous. This is, I mentioned, the Goose and Gridiron. This is the Crown in Drury Lane, and this one here is the Apple Tree at Covent Garden. Let's move on. So that explains these operative masons. Masons had come from outside London to help with the rebuilding. And it's particularly important here because this was seen by King Charles II and King James II as rebuilding the church was a national project for the country. Let's move on. This was old St. Paul's before the fire of London. And unfortunately, or whatever, lightning had struck the tower. The steeple was made of wood, and there was just this frame. It had fallen through, and it was seen as a bad omen because God had spoken to the people. However, the Stuarts believed that they were the incarnation of King Solomon. The reason why is a little bit complicated to explain. Please read my book for details. But they felt that they had to rebuild King Solomon's temple to receive the second coming of Christ, which for a variety of reasons they thought was imminent. It sounds strange to us, but at the time people were both very religious and very superstitious. However, this rebuilding of King Solomon's temple, which is actually St. Paul's, became a national project. One of the designs suggested for the rebuilding was by the Rabbi Jacob Templar, who lived in London. And this is his design for King Solomon's temple to be in London. It's not exactly how we think about it now, but here is the wall that went around, you can see, went all the way around it. The king decided on a cruciform design instead of this, which was designed by Christopher Wren. This is the same cathedral that is now in London, and it was completed in 1711, 5 years before the meeting at the Apple Tree Lodge, where it was decided to start a Grand Lodge of Freemasonry. Interestingly, because so much had been burnt, they were thinking about redesigning the streets. After the fire of London, the ground was so hot that it took 3 days for the ground to cool so people could actually walk into the area and start looking for things and measuring. But there were very few markers left to indicate where people's houses were or where the streets were. And it was thought perhaps it was possible to rebuild London to make it look like Paris with all its wide avenues and boulevards. But if you look at this design, what is interesting is it's actually built on the Tree of Life. You can see the triangles here. And this would be Tippereth, and where St. Paul's Cathedral was going to be. Unfortunately, because of people owning land and land ownership and other reasons, this was never put into a project. In 1688, the Dutch Prince William was invited to become king as he was married to Queen Mary of England. You will know them because they founded the College of William and Mary in Virginia in 1693, and also there is a fort in New Hampshire named after them. William introduced gin from the Netherlands to help the economy. Unfortunately, because gin was so cheap, it led to widespread drunkenness. And you can see starving soldiers and woman drunk. She's dropping a child down the stairwell. The man selling his saw to the pawnbrokers. There are people fighting and all sorts of problems. There's even a suicide can be seen. Very sorry situation. In 1717, John de Sagoulier with the help of Anthony Sayer, and unfortunately there is no picture of George Payne, but they set up the Premier Grand Lodge, and they were based in taverns like other lodges. They didn't have their own building. Then 6 years later, in 1723, they published the first constitutions of Freemasonry. By then, the Grand Masters, this is de Sagoulier here, they had invited nobility, aristocrats, to be Grand Masters. And this is the first Grand Master, the Duke of Montague, and he's wearing his Duke's robes. And this is, on the right, is the new incoming Grand Master, the Duke of Wharton. In here you can see the 5 orders of architecture with Apollo at meridian height, the beauty and the glory of the day. There are lots of other hints hidden in this picture, but I can't talk about them because they refer to the 3rd degree. Interestingly, Montague is handing the constitutions, but only a compass to the new Grand Master. There is no square. Unfortunately, the Duke of Wharton was a bad influence on Freemasonry, and I think he wanted to make it into a fashionable drinking club, but he was expelled 6 months after becoming Grand Master. In 1720, there had been a run on the stock market that ruined thousands of people financially. It was called the South Sea Bubble. A company had been started to trade in gold in the South Seas, meaning South America. There was a mad scramble to buy stocks in this company. Shares started at £100 in January 1720, but by June they were already £1,000 each. So obviously only the very wealthy could buy the stock. But the price collapsed overnight and many people lost everything. It has been suggested that the first Grand Master, Anthony Sayer, was one of them, as he asked Grand Lodge for charity 3 times after the crash of the South Sea Bubble. This picture is also by Hogarth, and there are so many interesting things in here. For example, this is a carousel, a merry-go-round. It says, "What a ride up here." And these are people who are being taken for a ride, basically, as the words suggest. But there's so many other people who want to get onto the carousel. And then there's people being whipped because he can't pay the money back. But interesting, you look at this person on the right, he looks like he's got animal legs. And on this side, we can see the devil. And there's a suicide here. And you can see the devil, cheering everybody on. Down in this corner, there is a rabbi with his breastplate on, a Catholic and a Protestant, and they're all playing a game of dice. Over here, this is the monument to the Great Fire, but Hogarth has renamed it to say that it's the monument to the South Sea Bubble that nearly destroyed the country. Another of Hogarth's famous etchings is called Night. And here we see 2 Freemasons, the master with his apron, very long apron, and his jewel, being helped by probably the Tyler, who has a sword. But in those days, gentry often wore swords. You can see the rummer, which is a large glass, and the grapes. So we know it's the rummer and grapes. What is interesting is the rummer and grapes was right next to the Houses of Parliament in the fashionable part of town. But here we see citizens, ruffians, whatever, attacking a coach. And they have wooden swords. You can see it's not a real sword. This is a real sword, and this is a wooden sword. The reason for that is that 47 years before this was drawn, and this was drawn in 1736, so in the 1690s, the possession of swords was made illegal. This was only the aristocracy were allowed to, aristocracy or gentry were allowed to wear swords. Therefore, the idea was to reduce crime in London. So after the Duke of Wharton, who was expelled from Masonry after only 6 months, he went and set up a competing organization, which he called the Gormagons. And the objective was to humiliate Freemasons. Freemasons at the time used to have public parades through London, particularly when a new Grand Master was elected. And the Gormagons interfered by gate crashing the parades and making a noise with drums and banging on pots and pans and whatever other interference they could do. They also spread false rumors. And this picture is one of their ideas of sort of negative advertising for the Freemasons. What we see is of interest is we have four Chinese people leading a small procession of Freemasons. This comes very apparent in my book when you see it. This is meant to be Confucius, and these are mandarins, and they got the correct clothes for the time. This may have been the Duke of Wharton himself. In the bucket, there's a mop, which in those days they used to use chalk and charcoal to write on the floor of the tavern to explain the ritual to people, and they needed a mop and bucket to clean it up. This is the ladder from the ritual, and it has James Anderson, who is the author of the Constitutions, his head stuck in it. This is de Sagulier as a jester, and this is Payne here. In the background, you can see a man holding a sword representing the Tyler, and the person with a feather, I believe, is meant to be the Duke of Montague, because he was a duke. Anyway, there's a lot of information here, and I can't tell you about it to a mixed audience. I apologize. This last slide was drawn by somebody called Paulsa in 1812. So 1 year before the union of the Grand Lodges of the Ancients and the Moderns, and nearly 100 years after Freemasonry had been revived. What you can see is the ritual is still being done on the floor, whereas nowadays, particularly in America, but in also other jurisdictions, it is acted out. However, less so in Europe, I believe. We can see that the aprons are now rounded, so they don't have a square and triangle like they do now. Many people, this is maybe the warden, but he's holding two swords, his own private sword and the symbolic sword. This person here looks like he's a warden. He has a sword on. This person has a sword on. So it was quite common for people to have swords even inside a house. The master is not wearing a hat. He has the square on, so we know he's a master. What else can we see? Also, the people are wearing colorful clothes. So the type of Freemasonry we know in Europe, particularly where people wear dark suits, black ties, like I always wear a black tie because that is part of being a Freemason, in England anyway. So this is what we talked about came from this book, The Initiation by Light. And in each book cover, I have included the River Thames because Freemasonry started in London, and the Thames and the buildings either side have a lot of importance to the story. So the spiritual alchemy, for example, is all about this area, the City of London, and in the corner, this is the Tower of London. This focuses on the London Bridge. And over here, we have Westminster Abbey and the fashionable part of London. And in the foreground, we have the South Bank. Interestingly, I talked about the further of religion. We can see they have 3 cathedrals. This is actually, I think this one here is Southwark Cathedral. These 2 no longer exist. But at the time, they had 3 cathedrals, an abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, and all these churches. And the population was only about 500,000. Anyway, let's see. We can see from my short introduction the difficulty that the first 3 Grandmasters, Anthony Sayer, George Payne, and John de Sagoulier, had to make a success of Freemasonry. London at the time was difficult for many people, particularly those in the City of London and the South Bank, where there was widespread drunkenness. The streets were not safe to walk about. There was no street lighting, and there was also no sanitation. Many of Charles Dickens' books describe this social decay. A typical one, which is of interest, talks about the life on the river, is called Our Mutual Friend. Even though it was written in 1860, which is 150 years after the start of Freemasonry. But not much had changed in that time. On the other hand, getting nobility to support Freemasonry by being its Grand Masters and later royalty allowed Freemasons to survive where other similar organizations did not. 3 years ago, we celebrated the 300th anniversary of Freemasonry because of the dedication of these 3 men, Sayer, Payne, and de Sagoulier. But here is another puzzle, and of course I talk about it in my book. Why did 3 educated and busy gentlemen decide to rewrite the ritual of an operative masons guild? They were not laborers or stonemasons. De Sagoulier was a member of the Royal Society. Payne was a director of the tax office in the same building where Isaac Newton was working in the Mint. So what was their reason? This and much more can be found in my books. Thank you.